Hi, everybody. Welcome back to True Crime Unsolved. I'm Miles Reef. I'm here as always with my buddy Sean Cahill. This is the place where we tackle the stories that the TV networks won't touch. Unsolved homicides, missing persons cases, stories without an ending. Sean, what are we getting into today?
We're going into uncharted waters, everybody. This is something we have not yet done, which is we're going to post a collaboration we did with another channel called Crime Solvers Central. It's actually a spinoff of a really popular web sleuth website, crimesolverscentral.com. It's a huge community of people who are interested in unsolved cases. If you haven't heard of it, you should definitely go check it out. They reached out to us kind of a while ago, asking if we'd like to be interviewed about some of the cases that we've covered. And we said, absolutely. Anything that sort of brings awareness to this is good. And the case we decided we wanted to chat about was Lacey Anderson's case, which we covered earlier this year. And it got a lot of attention, especially locally in Nebraska, where Lacey lived. So what you're about to see is not your typical episode of our show. It's actually us on someone else's show, but talking at length about that case and our experience covering it. And we thought this would be kind of a cool way to show you guys what we've been up to and also hopefully drive some of you over to their channel because they're fellow travelers in the mission to get some of these unsolved cases solved.
Absolutely. Yeah. And guys, do yourselves a favor. Go check out their website. It's really, really incredible the work they're doing.
Yeah, we had a great time doing it, and it's kind of long, so I don't want to waste any more of our time with the preamble. Let's go check it out.
Welcome back to Crime Solvers Central. I'm Charlie.
And I'm Jace. Today, we're discussing the unresolved case of Lacey L. Anderson from Norfolk, Nebraska, whose disappearance in August of 2009 and the later discovery of her body in Pierce County left her family with years of unanswered questions.
She was 19 years old from Norfolk, Nebraska, and according to official Madison County Sheriff's Department page, she was last seen by her mother on August 23rd, 2009 at 4 p.m. at their home on Syracuse Avenue in Norfolk.
3 days later, on August 26th of 2009, the Norfolk Police Division began investigating her whereabouts. This tells us that this began as a missing person case, and for almost 3 months, Lacey's family did not have the answers that they were desperately searching for.
Then on November 14th, 2009, Lacey's body was discovered in Pierce County. The official page says Norfolk Police, the Madison County Sheriff's Department, and the Nebraska State Police were following leads related to the cause of death.
A local news report after Lacey's funeral described family and friends mourning her. That same report said investigators still did not know what happened to her and asked anyone with information to contact Nebraska State Crime Stoppers.
The part that stays with me is that quote from Lacey's mother from the 2009 report. Someone took my daughter and didn't bring her back. That line really captures the pain and uncertainty this family has lived with.
And that's why we're talking about Lacey today. Not because this is an old case. Not because it's a mystery for entertainment. But because somebody may still know something.
What's the emergency?
No problem. All units are by
I'm at the corner of Pleasant Hill and John Young Freeway.
1519 East 18.
Joining us today are two guests who have spent a lot of time covering Lacey's case in detail, Sean and Miles from True Crime Unsolved. They're a channel on YouTube, and they're on Amazon, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Pocket Casts. We will provide links to all of their channels in the video description. Sean and Miles, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, absolutely. It's our pleasure to be here.
You've both done prior work on this case, including interviews, case breakdowns. From what we've seen, True Crime Unsolved has covered Lacey's story through several angles, including case timelines, family interviews, and discussions of unanswered questions.
And we do want to say this up front because Sean and Miles have already covered this case to an extent. We're going to treat today's episode almost like a guided panel. Charlie and I will walk through the known timeline, and then we'll ask questions that give Sean and Miles room to explain what they've learned and what they believe still needs clarification, as well as what the public should understand.
Before we get into the timeline, we want to talk about Lacey as a person. She wasn't just a case file. She's someone's daughter, sister, friend, classmate.
Public memorial information says that Lacey Anderson was born on June 9th of 1990. She graduated from Norfolk High School in 2008 and had worked locally while attending school.
The local report from her funeral described a packed church with family members talking about her smile, her presence, and the space she left behind. Her sister Felicia was quoted saying, "There will be no more hugs." And her family spoke openly about the pain of not knowing what happened.
And that's something that we want to keep returning to in this episode. When a case remains unsolved, families don't just lose a loved one once. They lose them again and again and again every single time that there's no answer, no accountability, and no resolution. So, Sean, Miles, let's start with the reason that you started, you're reviewing this case in the first place. What is it that drew you to Lacey Anderson's case?
Well, we do a lot of research and we do a lot of outreach. And the starting place for us is always, of course, an unsolved case. And we try to, on our channel, profile a mixture of more recent unsolved cases, whether they're, homicides or disappearances, missing persons cases. And we also try to do some older ones. And Lacey's was one of these older ones that to us didn't seem like there was a lot of coverage of. It's an older case that you would think would have a lot of TV shows about it, a lot of podcasts, but there actually wasn't too much. And we were able to locate her family and ask them if they wanted to talk to us, decades after the fact. And that's always our starting point. We don't do anything on our channel without family buy-in, as we call it. And they were very gung-ho about it and very happy to do so. And so that's kind of where the whole thing kicked off. I mean, Miles, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I mean, like Sean said, I would just reiterate just that the family buy-in is really, really important to us. And the fact that they were so passionate about it and they hadn't been given the platform that we felt that they deserved to get the story out there really inspired us to go hard on it. And then so many of them were willing to do these long-form interviews that it turned into something really good for us. So
Before we get into theories or unanswered questions, what are the core confirmed facts that viewers need to understand?
oh man. Well, the facts, definitely, look, the facts are out there. I mean, it's a pretty well covered case in sort of the unsolved community online. But I guess the things that have always really stood out for me are how long she was missing before her remains were discovered. I think that's something that's really always stood out because it was like close to 3 months from when the night that Lacey went missing, when her family, reported her missing the next day to when her remains were actually found. And I think also where she went missing compared to where her remains were found is also really, really important. And then I think there's also a lot of circumstances that we can probably get into as we move along that were in Lacey's life at the time of her disappearance that I do think are important. Whether or not we know whether they played a role into what happened to her, I think it is still important for context. Sean, what do you think?
Yeah, I would agree. I think what stands out to me about Lacey's case is that a lot of the facts are the glaring unknowns here. I mean, this was a missing persons case for several months before it became an unsolved homicide. And it's also a case where I think it's important to remember even the homicide part hasn't been confirmed. It's just strongly, strongly, strongly suspected. This is a case where we don't know if she was shot, if she was poisoned, or if she expired. There's the remote possibility that she expired from natural causes. I don't think many people believe that when they look at this story. But to me, the facts are, why was this person found in this strange area deceased so long after her disappearance? How did she wind up there? And why don't we know what led to her death? Unfortunately, her remains were in such a state that, that to me becomes the fact-finding essence of this case. But we could talk about timeline too. There are things that are known facts, right? We know that the last person to see her alive was her mother. We know that she went missing on August 23rd, 2009, and she was found on November 14th, 2009. Beyond that, we don't know much.
And thank you for that. That was actually going to be my next question is, for people coming to this case for the very first time, what would be the timeline anchors?
So what we know is that the last time that Lacey was seen was by her mother, and that was on August 23rd, 2009. And then we also know that in August 26th, 2009, that's when the police actually began investigating her whereabouts.
The family actually called it in the next day, but they were told by the cops that they had to wait at least 48 hours before she could be considered a missing person. So on November 14th, 2009, months later, that's when her remains were found in Pierce County. So I don't want to call it a body, and I don't want to get too gruesome about it, but the state that Lacey was in when she was found months later was not great. And I would call them remains, and they were kind of scattered in the area that she was found. We also, know who she was found by and all of that. But then on November 20th, 2009, local news covered her funeral. And that's when investigators still didn't know what happened. I mean, as far as dates, that's really all we have because nothing's been found out since then.
And expanding a bit on that very haunting time period wherein she was considered a missing person between the time of, late August and then into mid-November, let's talk a little bit about what we know about that time period, what we don't know. I mean, can you expand a little bit on that gap?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things we run into on a lot of cases, and this one was no exception, is that for a while, like I said, Lacey was a missing person, and the family knew. They knew in their gut that she didn't wander off on her own, that she did not choose to disappear. And I think that because of her lifestyle at the time, she was known to have, substance abuse problems. She was dealing with a court case involving a drive-by shooting. There was stuff going on in her life that I think from the law enforcement perspective, they see and they wonder, anything could have happened to this person. They're living a troubled life. This could be somebody who is on some sort of a drug bender and has disappeared, but will wind up being discovered, at a shelter or a hospital or something like that in a couple weeks. These things happen, right? But the family during this entire time period was advocating for the fact that something really, really bad was happening, and it was probably at the hands of another person. I think that there certainly were law enforcement that took that seriously. I'm not discounting the fact that that was on the menu for them. But when you're going through this kind of a thing as a family where you just don't know, it can be frustrating to feel like not every single effort is being poured into that, when something this important is happening. And so there's, of course, a ticking clock too, right? This is a vulnerable person who, by all accounts, should have turned up at her family's home, at some point in the next 24 hours and did not. So, Miles, do you have anything to add?
Well, I think it's, not to make this a more general conversation, but that's something, Sean and I have covered a lot of missing persons cases. And something that we've run into over and over again is that when a young person or a younger person disappears like this, the initial response tends to be from law enforcement that, hey, they probably made a choice and they're going to show up eventually. And this is something that families hear over and over again. And as we all know, there's a reason why The First 48 is an extremely popular show that's run for many years because, we all know, and most of the viewers probably know, that first 48 hours of an investigation are extremely important. And when, you're being told like, hey, she probably is just on a bender, or hey, she probably ran off with a boyfriend or something like that. And in your heart that, your kid wouldn't have done that because there was a family event. And no matter how into whatever she was into at that time, she still always showed up for her family because that's something that we've been told by everybody that we've spoken to from the family. That something's wrong, but there's nothing you can do about it. And the authorities are sort of in this waiting period because they're like, young kid, she was into some stuff. She's probably, off doing her thing. It's extremely frustrating. And I'm not pointing fingers at the cops. This is just something that we've heard over and over again from, Lacey Anderson to, Sean, what are some of the other cases where, who's the girl in Florida? It was the same thing.
It's most of them, when it's missing persons case, it happens pretty frequently because the truth is that most of the time missing people do turn up and the police know this. But we're covering the cases where that's not what happened. Right. And so a lot of the time, these people are a little frustrated with the early hours of these investigations. The other thing I'll say, and maybe we can leave it here for this part of it, is that Lacey, for all of her problems, was known to always show up to family events, to always check in with her family, no matter how bad the drug issue was, no matter what was going on in her life. She always, always, always kept in touch. And so I think that was the biggest clue for them in these couple months before her remains were discovered that, something was seriously wrong.
Yes, I agree. Definitely. People know their people. You know your people's tendency. if they're going to show up and things like that. You know that. The official page says Lacey's body was discovered in Pierce County. What is the significance of that location compared to Norfolk? Am I pronouncing that correctly, guys, here? Thank you.
I mean, I think, look, it's not, we're not talking about like, a distance between states, right? These areas aren't that far from each other. I think the one piece of information I think that's interesting about this from our investigation is that Pierce is actually where she grew up. So Norfolk was where she was living and where her mom was living at the time. But Pierce County was actually where she had grown up as a kid and had history. There was confirmed sightings, according to the family members that we've interviewed again, that there was graffiti that was seen after she had disappeared that said Lacey was going home or something along those lines. So they've always pointed to that as a clue that like there were people out there who knew what had happened to her and that they were kind of pointing at, where she might have been found. Other than that, I don't know if there is any significance to it. I mean, other than obviously it goes back to this time period of 3 months in between when she leaves her mom's house and when her remains are found. And where was she? How long was she alive during that period? Where was she? What was she being moved around? How did she get to that area? I guess is the big question, right?
I can add something to that too. I think that the significant thing that I've always thought about this is, even though she grew up in Pierce County, where her remains were found was a very rural area on like basically a farmer's property, I think along a fence line. And so the real question is, why was she there? Is this a place that she was taken to either alive or deceased and placed there because it's out of the way and it would be somewhere that someone would be unlikely to find her for a certain amount of time? And if she went there on her own, then why, right? That would be really significant because then that would present an entire other mystery. She doesn't live there. It's not where she was planning to be that night or that day. None of her, social circle is known to be there. So why would she be there? It's not necessarily a fact, but like I said in the beginning, it's one of these unknowns that I think is critical, in this whole thing.
Yeah. And I'm sure we're going to get deeper into that, but I think what Sean just said is really, really important because I do have really strong feelings about this case as far as what I think happened. And I don't think that Lacey walked into that field and ended up on that fence line by herself and somehow just there. And then, her remains got scattered by wildlife. It just doesn't seem plausible.
I do agree with that. Of course, we're going to get a little bit more into detail about it, but it's hard to determine with the amount of time that she was missing whether she was there on her own or whether she was placed there afterward. It's not something that I feel we're going to be able to determine just by ourselves, unfortunately. But of course, you suspect foul play, we suspect foul play, and the family has been open about suspecting foul play. And you have had extended conversations with the family. So what is it that's, stood out to you about the way that Lacey's family has spoken about the case since she was discovered?
Yeah, I can start it off. I know, Miles, you'll have something to say about it too. It's just striking how much this family loved her. And I know that that's it sounds very pat and cliche. Of course, we all love our family members, but they have not stopped knocking down doors. I mean, one of the people we spoke to on our channel, Nick, who is actually Lacey's brother-in-law. He's married to Lacey's sister, Felicia. Basically derailed his entire path in life trying to find answers in this case. He had been studying for a criminal justice degree. He wanted to get into law enforcement. And what wound up happening at this time is he wound up doing his own sort of investigation and, going to dangerous places and confronting dangerous people. He had guns pulled on him. And also his level of frustration with sort of the transparency between the investigator at the time, and there have been several since, but the person who was working it at the time and the relationship with the family got so sour and he got so disillusioned with the way that everything was working that he decided to go a completely different direction in his life. And I don't want to make it all about Nick, but it just shows you how profound this whole thing has been for them. It really has been life-altering in so many ways. Yeah, I mean, Miles, obviously the family, the mom, the dad, the sister all have their own versions of that story. But that one to me really hit me hard.
Yeah. No, Nick, I mean, it's interesting because I'm sure you guys have had similar experiences where you sort of correspond with people over email, and then maybe you have an initial like kind of pre-interview over the phone, and you have one impression of somebody, and then you get onto a Zoom with them and have eye contact and talk to them for a couple of hours, and it completely changes what you thought. And Nick was just a revelation, I think, to us in a lot of ways, and turned out to be a great resource for us, as we promoted the episodes, and he was just extremely involved. And, he was Lacey's brother-in-law, like he wasn't even a blood relative. And he had such a sort of like older brother, protective attitude towards her that it was just very impressive. But the one thing that I would say about the family, and this isn't just from us speaking to them, but it's also, from going back and like seeing the news coverage and, reading their public statements, they've always been consistent. And I think that's really, really important, because look, families always, sort of like, want help. And they're always like saying like, we need more help. And why isn't anything happening with the investigation? Right. You see that a lot. But I think with Lacey's family, they've always been consistent in their messaging that something happened to her, that somebody did something to her. And there's lots of different theories about what that could be. And there's lots of things that were going on in Lacey's life, obviously, but they've always been consistent that they felt that there was foul play involved, that she didn't end up there on her own, and that there was more to this than just, some sort of accidental death. And I think that's really, really important.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you almost answered the next question. Maybe I'll just rephrase it a little bit. I know that, you guys have had several conversations with the family. Has there been anything else that has really stood out and been really impactful to help you gain a better understanding of the situation, who Lacey was herself? Just anything else that really stood out to you about those conversations?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because Lacey obviously had her troubles, and she was a young person, and I always like to believe I've had my troubles, so I grew out of them and became a productive member of society, and I always want to give people the benefit of the doubt, and what I was impressed with as far as her family's description of her just as a person is just that she did, as we said earlier, she's always showed up, no matter where she was, what kind of a bender she was on, what kind of crazy relationship she was involved in. She always showed up for her family, and they always knew where she was. And it wasn't one of those situations where she would use them and, disappear. She was a member of that family. She was a troubled member of that family, but she was a member of that family. And you could see that they all really, really, really loved her. And it had a huge impact on them when this happened.
One thing that stuck out to me about Lacey and the way that they talked about her was that it's hard to talk about her without talking about all the troubles that were going on in her life that we've discussed already, but that she seemed to be at a point where things were going to turn around. She, her experience being involved in this drive-by shooting, which we'll probably talk more about later. This is an incident where a child was in a home, that a gun was fired at, and she found out later that, that this could have resulted in the death of a child, right? And I think it really hit her hard. And we got to remember, this is a 19-year-old person, right? An adult on paper, but 19 is 19. That's still a teenager. And I think that she had made a lot of mistakes in her short life and really was in a place where she was trying to find a way out. She had gotten into some pretty deep waters. I think the people that she was around and the people that knew her were older, and in some cases a lot more dangerous in some cases. But Lacey, there was an off ramp, like you could see it. If she hadn't had gone missing and then been found deceased, I'm assuming from foul play, she probably would be, like Miles said, a productive member of society today. I don't see her as somebody who was about to lead a lifelong, criminal life. I don't think that was what was in her future. I think she's somebody who made some mistakes early and had the room and had the time and had the temperament to sort it out, right? And she was denied that.
Yeah, and just to add to what Sean just said, it does seem like what she was involved with on a legal level at the time of her disappearance was kind of acting as a wake-up call to her from speaking to her family, and that, it was almost like scared straight. And she had been speaking to the police, And it did seem like she was trying to find a way out of it, or at least cooperate to a point where, find a way through without it, ruining her life forever. And obviously that could possibly be part of why she disappeared.
Something I want to pause on is the idea that because a case is from 2009, people may think that the window for answers is closed. But that's not true.
Exactly. In many old cases, answers come years later because someone finally talks. Someone remembers something. Technology improves. Relationships change. Or a person who was afraid before finally feels safe enough to come forward.
And a tip doesn't have to be a confession. It could be something like, I saw a vehicle. I heard someone say something. Someone acted strange afterward. I know where someone was that weekend. Or I heard a rumor, but I never reported it.
And sometimes those fragments can matter. We'd like to play a short clip from the interview that Sean and Miles did with Lacey's family.
So what was it like for you as a parent? Because a lot, obviously a lot of kids, especially at that age, go through a phase and then it ends at some point, right? But it seems like for Lacey, the phase started and kind of just got worse and worse, unless I'm reading the situation wrong. But tell me about like your experience trying to like navigate that as her mom.
Well, she went to treatment. If I found any paraphernalia on her, she'd get grounded, car taken away, not able to do things with her friends. And then she'd act out on that. Suicide a few times, tried to commit suicide. So then you're scared to actually do anything like punish her because you don't want to take her life. But tough love is if you don't do it, she's going to go down the wrong road anyway. So we went through that for a good 4 years.
Now, from everything that you've reviewed, what are your biggest unanswered questions?
Yeah, I'll jump in there. I feel like I laid some of them out in the beginning, but I think the biggest one here, when I back out and I look at Lacey's story, is every single scenario that people take seriously basically leads back to the fact that it had become public knowledge she was talking to the police about this one particular drive-by shooting incident. But that reputation as someone who was willing to talk to the police about criminal activity changed the way she was perceived by a lot of very dangerous people in that community. And unfortunately for Lacey, she was close with a lot of very dangerous people. And so to me, the biggest unknown is which one of these people, it's almost like a game of Clue. You've got these 9 people in a house littered with candlesticks and rope, but which one of them actually did it? That's how I look at this case. I think there's a lot of intriguing folks on the list. I think there's a lot of intriguing relationships, and all of them have the motive. But what we can't seem to put together is which one and how and why. Like how can we place this person, in other words, in the library with the candlestick to continue down the Clue metaphor? We haven't been able to do that yet.
Right. And I think just from a more simplistic sort of like forensic view, the biggest question is what happened to her? Where was Lacey during that missing period, right? From when she was reported missing to when her remains were found, and how did her remains end up in that field on the fence line of that guy's property? That's the big question, because if you could answer that, then you could probably answer what Sean just positioned, which is who was she with, and how did she end up deceased?
Yeah, those are a lot of the same questions that I think we all have as well. And I know that in some, unresolved cases, the very first theory can kind of shape the entire investigation. We talked about it a little bit earlier, how the police, you had said, seemed to assume that it was a voluntary disappearance, that she had run away or that she had wandered off on her own. From your own research, do you think that those early assumptions might have affected Lacey's case, the way that it was handled?
100%. Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt about that, because if the police had immediately gotten involved and started looking for her and knocking on the right doors, knowing the world that Lacey was in, as Sean had said, the people that she knew, the people that knew her, people that she was involved with, if they had gone to those places and looked for her, then they may well have found her. I'm not saying they would have found her before she had been killed, but they may have caught the people who did it, or they may have found her before she had been. But, waiting, I think affected that. Again, I'm not bashing the cops. I think, Sean and I always say that we're friends to the police. We've interviewed tons of cops in our careers, and I call a lot of, retired detectives friends because of that. But I do think that that hesitation did affect the ability to either stop Lacey from being killed or immediately catch the people who did it. I would also say that, and I think this is important because Lacey's not the only person out there with a similar lifestyle who's gone missing or been killed. And I think, when you're dealing with crime and you're managing your time and you have limited resources, when a case comes across and it's like this person's involved with drugs, this person's living a dangerous lifestyle, there's a hesitation to sort of take it as seriously sometimes, I think, than if someone, is like, prom queen and, squeaky clean person with like influential parents who show up and say, hey, my daughter's been missing for 2 days. And, there's a different attitude sometimes. And let's just be honest. And I think there's a bias sometimes, against folks who may have like substance abuse problems and stuff like that. It is what it is. I mean, I think, human life is human life, and everybody should get the same fair shake under the law. So, but I do think that who Lacey was and the lifestyle that she was known for may have even influenced it further than her just being young and that whole like, oh, she's probably just run off on her own. There were other factors there that I think influence that hesitation.
All right. And I know we touched on it just a little bit ago, the geography of it all, right? How she was last seen in Norfolk, but her body was found in Pierce County. What types of questions does that bring up? Is there some kind of significance in there? Something we might be missing?
Yeah, I think, it's like we talked about earlier, this strangeness of her no longer having a present day connection to this area. Just because she grew up there, there was no reason for her to be there at that time. And so it does make you ask, whose car did she get in? Was she forced to go to this place? When she got there, was she even alive? Or as we kind of touched on earlier, is it possible that Lacey was alive for several days during this missing period, or even weeks, or even months before she wound up deceased? I think that we have to allot a certain amount of time between the discovery and her death because of the nature of how the remains were found. Scattered, predators had gotten to it, so she had been there for a certain amount of time. But as far as the relationship between Pierce County and where she was living, the biggest one is just that it doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, why would she be there? I think if we can answer that question, then now we're on to something.
But I think the even more significant part is what Sean touched on earlier, which is it's not just Pierce County, it's where, right? It's that she was found in this, field on this fence line. And, there's been talk about like, maybe Lacey overdosed or something like that. But it's like you don't walk into the woods and just like hang out along a fence line and overdose, by yourself. I didn't grow up in the country, but I just don't imagine that's how things go down, So the specific location of where her remains were found is really, really important because it feels like it could possibly be a dump site, a lack of a more, delicate way of putting it.
Well, and another thing I'll add too is that we saw some comments on our channel, and it's come up from time to time that maybe Lacey was with people and she overdosed and that they panicked and took her and put her there. In other words, no real foul play, as no one intended for her to die, but that people didn't want to get in trouble and they moved her body. And my feeling on that has always been, you almost never see that really happen, but you do see a lot of overdose deaths in this country. And most of the time, people don't drive their friends to the woods and leave their body. You do see people drop people off at the hospital or call 911 and then leave, put someone on the front lawn and get out. People do get scared, of course. Maybe there's a house full of drugs. They don't want anyone in a uniform coming there, but they usually find another way to handle it. It would be really surprising to me. It's not impossible, but I think it's improbable to think that somebody would take a friend who was experiencing an overdose and drive them out to a wooded area and just kick them out of the car. On the list of possibilities, sure, nowhere near the top for me.
Yeah, and just
the
one
fact
more
that she was
thing.
also
Oh, no, go ahead, Jay.
found in pieces as well. I think that's another thing that sort of goes against that theory, in my opinion, at the very least.
Yeah. Well, I think it comes down to it's very binary for me. Is it an execution site or is it a dump site? because she was either walked down into that field and something was done to her, or something had already happened to her, and that field was a place to kind of like get rid of her body.
Now, how important is it, in your opinion, that the nearly 3-month gap between when she was last seen and when her body was found, how important is that gap, in your opinion?
I think the most important thing about that gap is that because of the state of her remains, whether they showed up there the day after she disappeared or whether they showed up later, as we've discussed, the decay that had happened, obvious interference by wildlife and predators and the weather itself, it made it impossible to identify any time or cause of death. Looking at the gap, it's really about like the length of time that she had been out there and the lack of forensic evidence because of that, I think, is really important.
Thank you. Yeah, and backing up a bit, I know that you guys have covered cases before where family members have, information, concerns, their own opinions, memories that, may not appear or be available in official documents. How is it that you balance these family accounts versus what's publicly reported?
It's a great question. It's a great question, and it's really important to us. I think both of these sides of a story are very important. The official documents, the law enforcement side of things, the police reports, affidavits, things like that are critical. And we try to go over that information usually in what we call our case breakdown videos, where we're not interviewing anybody. We're going over just the facts, ma'am, And then the family side of things is where things get more subjective, but in a lot of ways more interesting, because these are people who are very close to the story. They're very close to either the victim or the missing person, depending on what case we're talking about. And they have an inside knowledge of this person's life that law enforcement, frankly, just doesn't. They can interview a bunch of people. They can take notes. They can look through your phone, but they're never going to really know you as a person the way that your mom or your friend or your spouse does. And so when we talk about stories like Lacey's, where from a police perspective, they see a missing young woman who's had a bunch of recent court dates and is involved in a serious crime, she's got substance abuse issues, that's going to color their view of this one way. When you talk to Lacey's mom and you learn that no matter what happened in her life, she always checked in with her, now we have another piece of information. So that's why, doing what we do on our channel is we really do value trying to interview as many people as we can from as many different sides of these stories as we can, so that our audience and us get the best 360 understanding of these cases. I will say our North Star is the family. I don't think we've ever done one story where we just talk to a detective and the family. Usually we start with them and then work our way out from there. Yeah, it's a good question. They're all important.
Yeah, I would just say, like Sean said, the reason we do those case breakdowns is because we want to sort of present the basic facts of the case as they're known through the official documents. And then that's kind of the door that opens up to these long form interviews that we do with the parents, right? Or, other family members. Sometimes we even get an investigator, but it's like Sean said, it's really about the families for us.
At this point in the episode, we have the foundation. Who was Lacey when she disappeared and when she was found, and why this case still matters.
In part 2, we're going to go deeper into the theories. We're going to go deeper into the public questions surrounding the case, what Sean and Miles learned from covering it, and what information might still move this case forward.
And again, we want to stress, the goal is to not accuse. The goal is to ask responsible questions, encourage tips, and keep Lacey Anderson's name in the public view.
Lacey was 19. She had a future, and her family deserves answers. And someone may still know what happened.
Well, let's talk about it a little bit then, because obviously, she had her troubles early, it sounds like in middle school. And then high school came and things got even crazier. But when do you think this really got serious? And I guess what started the events in motion that would eventually lead to the whole reason that we're talking today?
It all stems on a guy. It all goes back to a guy thing. She got hooked up with a certain guy, and that was her life. She was going to marry him and moved out with him for a little while and moved back into home afterwards. And once they turn 18, you can't tell them what to do. I mean, you think you can tell them what to do, but she's a tough cookie.
Right. Now,
Um,
the guy that you're talking about, that's the person who was her ex at the time when she went missing, right?
yes.
Welcome back. We're continuing our discussion on the unresolved case of Lacey Anderson, a 19-year-old from Norfolk, Nebraska, who was last seen in August of 2009 and whose body was later discovered in Pierce County in November of that same year.
In part 1, we covered the known timeline. Lacey was last seen by her mother on August 23, 2009. Norfolk police began investigating her whereabouts on August 26th, and her body was discovered in Pierce County on November 14, 2009, according to the Madison County Sheriff's Department.
Now we're going to move into the questions that still surround this case. We'll talk about theories, rumors, investigative challenges, and how to discuss all of that responsibly.
And again, we're joined by Sean and Miles from True Crime Unsolved, who have previously covered Lacey's case through timeline breakdowns, family-focused episodes, and theory discussions. Podcast listings of their work describe episodes focused on chronology of Lacey's disappearance, discovery of her remains, family interviews, and the most widely discussed theories around the case.
So, Sean and Miles, when people talk about this case, what are some of the main theories that tend to pop up?
Oh man,
I
I'll give it.
mean,
I'll give 1 or 2 miles and toss it to you. I'll say there's a lot of them, but they all center around the idea that Lacey had been publicly identified as someone who was cooperating with the police. We've heard from so many people during our coverage. I mean, it really blew our minds. We got emails, phone calls, texts from it felt like everybody in that county, basically. At some point.
can I talk about the newspaper?
Yeah, go ahead. Tell us.
So many people told us that Lacey had been outed as an official informant by a local newspaper. And we kind of we took it for what was said and we basically put it out there. And then the newspaper actually got in touch with us and kind of called us on it, which was, it was a good lesson for Sean and myself because, you guys probably know some of our background. Like we've done a lot of TV and everything's vetted and we're usually like lawyers watching everything. And we kind of didn't do it to ourselves to the degree that we usually would. And, we looked into it and people sent us articles and they were like, here it is. And we went through everything and it was like, well, it said that she had spoken to the police, but it didn't name her as an official informant. And a lot of people were pointing fingers and saying that this newspaper had actually outed Lacey and that was why she had been killed, because it was basically she had been outed as a rat by this official publication that everyone in this, small rural area read. So that was kind of an interesting lesson for us in, theories that are out there and sort of vetting them, and making sure that we do our homework. We actually, put out a kind of retraction. And I think, Sean, we got some comments of people calling us soft and that we were kowtowing to the man on that. But we try to stick to the facts. Every theory around Lacey sort of tends, as Sean said, to revolve around this drive-by that she was involved with, these charges that she was facing. I think we can say the boyfriend that she had been involved with, who was also involved in that shooting, was actually locked up at the time that Lacey disappeared. And he was locked up on the charges that Lacey was also going to be facing. As there's all sort of theories around him. There's all sort of theories around an ex-boyfriend. There's also theories around cartel interests that actually operate in this area. And the fact that, just because people thought that she had been talking, she needed to be silenced. Everything seems to sort of circle around the drug world and what Lacey was involved with in that world.
Yeah, and I should clarify, her current boyfriend was not the one that was in jail at the time for the drive-by. That was the ex, and then the current one was also involved in the drug trade and has since faced charges for that stuff, and I think has done some time as well. And so you can just see that, those are the first two obvious people that were looked at, not only by the police, but also by the family and everybody who really worked to get some answers here in the early days. Because not only are they the spouses, ex and current, but they're also involved in this dangerous, criminal sort of lifestyle. And it just was an obvious place to look. Interestingly, though, nothing has ever stuck in those directions. And as time has gone on, although both of those gentlemen sort of remain under scrutiny, other things have come out, right? Like the family received a couple of recordings from somebody that they shared with us and we reviewed, and we decided ultimately not to put on our channel because we felt it would endanger the person who made these recordings. But, this is recordings of somebody completely unconnected to those two guys talking about being there the night that Lacey was, and that it was actually someone else and she knows who it was. And it was still because they perceived her to be someone who cooperated with police, and she was dangerous to have around the social group because the social group revolved around selling drugs, and we can't have that here or we're all going to get in trouble. So whether or not there's any validity to those tapes, I know they were given to the police. The police have looked into it. And I think that happened at the end of 2024. And here we are a year and a half later, and we actually don't know what's happening with that. They could still be working that. It could have led to a dead end. It's sort of opaque. We're not sure, but it just goes to show you how many people around Lacey there were as potential suspects, and therefore those are your potential theories, right? And it could be that there are still ones yet to be discovered. I wouldn't be surprised if there were, because the web goes deep. And then without going really crazy, I mean, we got a lot of information too about like countywide corruption and public officials cooperating with the cartel and things that are like kind of really wild and speculative. And we have been very careful about discussing that because obviously that's, now we're in another level of theorizing, right? But I would be remiss to say that we didn't get dozens and dozens of emails and phone calls and comments from people about that angle, which may say just more about the public trust in Madison County than Lacey's case in particular, right? I don't know that they actually connect, but it's fair to say people certainly are suspicious that they might.
But there is other coverage on that, right? So, we also got sent like in-depth articles that have been written about this corruption or possible corruption and names named. And, we could certainly share some of that with you guys. But it does seem whenever we do a case that has a lot of questions around it like this, that's in a small rural area that has certain issues around it, we get a big response from the locals, and 9 times out of 10, people are claiming corruption on the part of either officials or the police themselves or some combination of it.
I almost feel like this next question is just like, it just answers itself. Is we're talking about these theories and we're talking about corruption and these things that feel very dangerous to me. The question is, what kind of theories should people be careful with? And as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking all of them. Like, this is some serious stuff, but I'm going to go ahead and ask you and your opinions, and your experience. What kinds of theories should people be careful with?
Yeah, I think you're right to say all. I mean, obviously, we want to be careful talking about cases like this where there are, there are people whose names are out there in the public as suspicious or, persons of interest, but it doesn't mean that they've done anything. And we have to be really careful as a community of like true crime viewers, creators, people who cover these stories, even if you're just somebody commenting, right? These are still people's lives. And until people have gone through a trial, right, we don't know how responsible they may or may not be. And it's always tempting to, talk about the boyfriend or the husband. I mean, we see it constantly on the stories that we cover. Someone always is in the comments naming names and accusing people. And I feel like, there's a certain level of that that's understandable, but that we have to be really careful with it. And especially as we get wider and wider and we're talking about things like, potential countywide corruption. And, okay, so maybe we have a public official who was caught in this sort of a scandal here. Is that really related to Lacey Anderson's murder or in disappearance, or are we just suspicious because the crime hasn't been solved? Here's a public official who's had some trouble. Maybe there's a conspiracy. Maybe there is, but I think that there's a lot of proving you have to do to get from A to B there, if that makes sense. And the only other thing I would say about it is that theories that sort of blame the victim always bother me, especially in stories like this, where it's a young woman who has troubles with, some shady boyfriends she dated maybe, and, substance abuse issues. And I don't really like to see theories where people kind of suggest that they brought it on themselves, or that's what you get, or, Not that that's necessarily a theory of what happened, but it is sort of a dismissal of the whole story in general. And so that's the one that I say that's harmful to the family. It's harmful to the case, and it's just not good dialogue, you know.
I will say, not to play devil's advocate, though Sean and I often do that to each other, but ignorance loves a vacuum. And if you're not getting out there and you're not getting ahead of the story and you're not trying to provide information about something, then this is what's going to happen, right? So sometimes I feel like it is on the authorities to sort of stay on top of things and get the messaging right. And I don't know that that's actually happened in Lacey's case. And because of that, there's wild speculation about not just the people that she was involved with, but also the police themselves, certain county officials who have some strange stuff around them. And, that's what's going to happen if you don't get out there and sort of, try to steer things in the right direction.
I completely agree. I mean, the fewer known facts, I feel, the more room there is to stir the rumor mill, and I think that's what happens a lot with online theories and debates about cases like this. I think that, to your point of some of the insensitive theories as well, there may be merit, but I think that it's more important to focus on not only the facts, but also the feelings of the living family members and, going over these theories about how it may have been her fault. I also agree that I don't think that's very productive. And I know that, some online summaries and reporting have talked about Lacey's mother. You guys have spoken about her as well. She believed that not only was there foul play involved, but that Lacey may have been in fear of her life. How do you think that sort of information should be handled in regards to the case?
Yeah, it's I think that's one of those things that almost ties into what we were talking about when we were comparing sort of the law enforcement facts to the family facts, because this is really important. It's so important to know from Lacey's own mother that she was afraid. She was afraid because of exactly the reasons that we all believe she went missing. Her reputation had been sort of flipped from participant in the drug using and selling community to outsider who is cooperating with the police and potentially dangerous to everybody there. She knew that, right? She told her mom that she was very nervous to talk to the police and that people knew this and people were treating her differently. And she understood that people get killed for this kind of thing. At the very, at the very least beaten up, or ostracized. I think those are the lowest level consequences, but she was afraid of being. And so when you look at somebody who has that going on in their life and then goes missing and turns up dead, it's almost impossible not to connect. And so I think that it has to be handled, to answer the question, in a way that it can't be taken out of the equation. I think it needs to be brought up every time we talk about Lacey, because it's her voice that's telling us what she was afraid was going to happen to her, and removing that is removing her own input into this situation.
Yeah, I agree 100% with what Sean said. And I would also like to add, wasn't just her mom who has told us that, she in a state of fear and that, she was worried about what may have happened to her. She was worried about what may happen to her before she actually disappeared.
That's good to know. That's good information. Going back to the discovery site where her body was found, we've talked about how it was very remote. And I'm wondering, how does a sort of rural or like semi-rural discovery site affect cases like this?
Yeah, and not well usually, because like we talked about, weather in Nebraska is notorious. Animals, are not friendly to clean crime scenes. And of course, it takes a long time to find somebody. It definitely appears to me, and I'm sure most people who look at this, that area was selected for a reason. And the reason was she might not turn up for a long time, which gives whoever did this time to further obscure their tracks and, hide evidence, destroy evidence. And also the fact that when she was found, we would run into a situation like we have, where it would be very difficult to tell what happened to her. So I think, yeah, it's really hard to remove a rural area like that from a case like this, because it's just such a hindrance, And you do see this from time to time, even in urban areas. When a murder is committed, sometimes the body is taken out somewhere in the sticks and left, because everyone knows it's harder to find. And when you get there, it's really hard to tell what happened.
Yeah. And I would just add that think about it. If that father and son hadn't been out checking the fence line because it was hunting season and they were making sure their property was secure, Lacey's remains may have completely disappeared. Because who knows, if they had been out there a little longer, there might have been nothing left, and they wouldn't even have anything to go on. She would just be a disappearance case.
Right. And of course, there's less cameras in a place like that. There's less traffic. There's less likelihood that someone will be walking by and see something that they'll remember later. But it is an interesting thing in a rural area like that because a lot of people know each other. They recognize each other's vehicles driving down the road. They recognize when things are out of place in a way that maybe some of us that live in the city don't think twice when we pass a stranger. There you might. And so it also it makes you think maybe the people responsible for this are known in that community and can move around it with impunity because people are used to seeing them. This might be a killer hiding in plain sight type of situation here.
Absolutely. And naturally you think, did she go there willingly? Did she go there unwillingly, like we touched on before? And how should we think about that? Does seem like a very odd location for her to be.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think I said this earlier, but to me, that location is either an execution site or a dump site. It doesn't feel like a let's go out into the woods and party area, especially, because they weren't even found it's like they were on somebody's property line, like along, a fence. Like it wasn't like some like known hangout spot where the rural kids go and it's, there's like rocks with graffiti on them and there's beer cans. That's not where she was found. It wasn't like the local watering hole or whatever. It was an odd place, and it wasn't somewhere where someone was just hanging out. I mean, and look, I could be wrong. I'm editorializing a little bit, but that's just my feeling about it.
Well, I'll say too, if it is a dump site, which my suspicion kind of is that it probably is rather than the actual site of the murder, although it could be, it makes it that much harder because now you have one more level removed of what happened to this poor young woman. If she was there, there's a much higher potential for, bullet casings, footprints, even just positioning of her clothing, her body, any of that starts to become more important. If she was somewhere else and then just transported there and left, it makes it almost impossible to find out what happened. Once you filter through the animal predation, the weather, the time, the scattering of her remains, and then it didn't even happen there. I mean, how, you tell me, how would you ever figure that out? And so I have a nasty feeling that whatever happened to Lacey happened somewhere else, and she was taken there because they didn't want the body to be found, Now that's my personal opinion. Obviously that's complete speculation on my part, but it just seems that way to me. I have a gut feeling about that when you look at the facts that it was probably a dump.
Oh, so for somebody watching who may have information, what kind of information would actually be helpful?
Anything. I mean, I think a lot of times people don't realize that they saw something that mattered, something that maybe wasn't suspicious to them at the time, but looking back on it, that girl seemed like she didn't necessarily want to get in that car with those guys, but they seemed to all know each other. So it didn't seem like a big deal to me at the time, you never know. So I think if anyone did see anything, and I do believe that multiple people probably have some idea of something around that night, or well, not to say that I know the night that whatever happened to Lacey happened. But I don't think any piece of information is too small in a case like this.
I would agree. And I think a lot of people are out there that probably have heard things about this case that are important and they haven't come forward, either because they don't realize that what they've heard or seen was important, but also I think there's a lot of fear. I mean, we got a lot of private communications from people scared out of their minds to talk about this case because they know something. They knew people. I mean, we got a lot of unverifiable stuff in that direction. And all we could tell people is please contact the authorities. Like Miles and I are here to platform stories, but we are not a tip line. We can pass information to families or interview guests, and we're happy to do that. But it doesn't move the case forward to tell me if you have information. It moves the case forward to tell the authorities in Madison County what you know. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of these people, like we said, have trust issues in that department and are afraid that there is a bigger, badder thing going on in that county, and that them coming forward will put them in danger. I would say I don't really believe that that's necessarily true. And I think that coming forward with information is a brave thing to do, and it is worth it. It is worth it to do. I think a lot of times the fear versus reality situation here is way out of whack and way out of balance. Consider the fact that this family doesn't know what happened to this young lady, and it's been many, many, many years. You might be the thing that could ease their situation.
Yeah, and I think that's something that people really, really need to understand is that time does not heal this kind of loss when there's no answers, right? I mean, we've all lost people. You get to a certain age, everyone has someone in their life that's passed away or disappeared or something. But if there's no answers to something like this, it hurts even more. And just putting these folks out of that misery that they're living in, not knowing what happened to their daughter and their sister. Yeah. I would encourage anyone, if anyone's listening to this or watching it and they do know something or they think they might know something, just come forward, be anonymous, whatever. But
I was going to say anonymous tip line. I'm not trying to put people off of it by bringing up some of the concerns folks have. There are anonymous tip lines. I think some people don't realize that. I think that people who maybe have something to say but are nervous about it, there's a reason those tip lines exist, right? They protect you. They get information to the people that need it without you having to identify yourself. And so I would point people in that direction in this case.
Yeah, especially I think that fear plays a part. And I think that a certain level of insecurity about maybe, I'm not helping by giving this information. That's something that lies in a lot of the back of people's minds. And I think that anonymous tip lines can really help, because even if you think that it's not going to do anything, if you think that it's insignificant, it might be significant. It very well might be. And going back, taking a bit of a step back, when you guys first covered Lacey's case, what is it that drew your eye to it? What was the main focus of that very first episode?
I mean, for me, it was the fact that she seemingly disappeared into thin air. There was no trace of her. And then, her remains show up 3 months later, and that she had all this stuff going on in the background. Those things combined, as Sean described it, like the game of Clue, where there were so many sort of players on the chessboard, right? And, there she is seemingly, disappearing and then showing up dead. It's a really, really intriguing case. I mean, look, we do this mainly to, sort of amplify these family stories and give them a platform. But obviously, there's an interest in this kind of stuff and just understanding human nature. And I think there's so many things at play in this story. Like Sean was saying earlier, the fact that it did seem like Lacey was at a turning point in her life. These charges that she was facing were really making her really reevaluate things according to her family, and that it seemed like if she had gotten through it and come out the other side, she might have been in a different place and actually changed things. And she was at this crossroads, and instead she ended up dead field. It's incredibly compelling, and for us, it's the family, right? It's always the family. And as soon as we started talking to them, and I think, Sean, you would agree with this, as soon as we started speaking with them, we got so pulled in by their grief and their passion and their desire to get answers that, there was no way we couldn't cover it.
Yep. I'll put one tiny thing at the end because I know you have other questions, but one of the important things for us too was the fact that Lacey's story is not that well covered. And one of the things Miles and I wanted to do when we decided to start this channel is not be the 1,000th person to talk about JonBenet Ramsey, right? There are other people covering that case. There are a lot of infamous missing persons and unsolved homicide cases. And we were specifically looking for ones that needed a little more attention. Now, granted, we've covered some that are fairly prominent. You kind of have to when you work in this space. But we also wanted to temper that with ones where we felt like maybe there's families out there who are dying to be on a podcast and no one is calling them, right? And Lacey 100% fit that bill. We had a hard time finding a lot about this case until we talked to her family, to be honest with you. I mean, most of what we learned came through them. So, yeah.
That's why I signed on to be a part of this Crime Solvers Central. To give voices and help people be heard that otherwise might not have had the opportunity to be heard. So feel that when you said that.
Yeah, when you guys
too.
reached out and I checked you out, I immediately knew there was an alignment. We love what you guys are up to. I think it's fantastic.
To add a little bit to
Appreciate
what
you
you were
guys.
saying too,
Mhm.
I was when I was doing research about Lacey's case, a lot of the videos that I saw were your guys' videos. I didn't see a whole lot else about it. There were some, there was some news coverage, but other than that and some articles, there wasn't a lot. So I think it's really admirable to, cover the lesser known cases and especially to speak to the families involved.
That's really gratifying to hear, Chase. Thank you. Because, obviously, Sean and I always say we're like a young channel, right? We've only been online for like 9 months. And the fact that we even came up in a search engine is nice to hear, And it's interesting because Lacey's case actually did really well for us. Like I think it was like, Sean, it was our first video that hit like 120,000 views, right? On the case breakdown. So there was definitely an interest in it, which just shows you that, there are other cases out there that could be elevated if people were willing to kind of look around and, go beyond the ones that everyone knows are safe, right?
Yes, 100%. After your episode aired, did viewers leave questions, or maybe even viewers that knew her leave memories that or possible information that changed how you thought about this case?
Oh, yeah. I think almost to what we were just talking about, this is the case for Miles and I that actually made us realize kind of the reach that you can have with a podcast or a YouTube channel, because you make these things and you put them out into the ether and then it's just numbers, right? Oh, this many people watched it, but it doesn't feel real. This is the case that felt real because we heard from so many locals in this area. It felt like the whole town watched these episodes, which was very bizarre for us, right? Because we don't live there, we're not connected to this area at all beyond just telling this story. But the amount of people that reached out and said that they knew Lacey, that they remembered her, either they went to high school with her or they remember this story, they maybe had information. It was mind blowing, right, Miles? I mean, like he said, right up to the newspaper contacting us to say, hey, we never wrote an article calling her an informant. Fair. But you did talk about her cooperating with the police, and maybe it was, interpreted that way, which is how that whole thing shook out. But it really, it touched us to see not only how many people watched that remembered and knew her and cared, but that it seemed like it was being talked about again, right? Which was the whole point of this exercise in talking about Lacey's story, was to bring it, 17, 18 years into the future and have it be relevant again. And I think that it felt successful in that way.
Yeah, I can't really add anything to that other than to say that our regular viewers also had a lot to say about the case. And Sean and I do these sort of like semi-weekly comment reaction vids where we'll interact with our core audience and kind of read their comments and give feedback. And people had a lot to say about Lacey's case. It was interesting.
I can imagine. I mean, both of our channels do cover unresolved cases, and we talked a little bit about the sort of responsibility that we have when we're covering those. The ways that we handle them, the ways that we talk about them, and the ways that we pass along information. In your opinion, what sort of responsibilities do we have when we're discussing cases like Lacey's?
Yeah, I mean, I think you guys have this similar approach to us, that you seem to present the facts, but you also try to center the victims and the families, right? And I think that's our approach too. That's why we always do those case breakdowns where we just kind of like lay things out as we know it without any speculation. We don't start theorizing or, going off on tangents. And then we open the door to the family for them to speak. As if the case gains a lot of traction and people have a lot to say about it, then we'll kind of react to that. And I think with Lacey's case, Sean, we even did an additional video where we kind of addressed all the theories and the suspects, because there are, as Sean has said multiple times, there's so many players in this. There's so many possible people who had a reason to possibly want to do something to Lacey because of the speculation around her possibly cooperating with the police about this case, that, we just had to kind of cover all of them, just to kind of like lay it out, like clearly, like these are who these people are. And these are what we know as far as like what's been found in the investigation on them. Right. And even that, we try to just lay out the facts. I mean, I think there's a responsibility to not necessarily make it about what we think may have happened, and, sort of as neutral of an observer on it as you can be, laying things out, and then also providing a platform for the family to get their story out.
Yeah. And like you said earlier, Jace, I mean, on a story like this, you have to understand that you may become and are likely to become part of like the public record, right? So that's a responsibility that people are going to Google Lacey Anderson and now they're going to see me, of all people, talking about her. And it's easy to forget, as we sit at our computers and create content, but people actually watch this stuff and take it seriously. And so, if you're going to make a serious channel and you're going to talk about serious things with people whose lives have been affected, it's really incumbent upon you to remember that at every moment, And that's why one of the things Miles and I have never wanted to do is just be the salacious true crime channel that reads the Wikipedia article and then goes and has fun with all the theories. I know that's a legitimate type of show. I'm not, casting any shade on that. That's just not something that we were interested in doing. In a way, it's actually kind of funny because I think for both Miles and I, we feel like it's the commenters and the viewers who get to have all the fun, right? We don't want to theorize. We don't want to, go crazy, but we do, enjoy reading what people's thoughts are. And the closest we get is usually answering questions that are along the lines of a theory and trying to make sense of it. But then even then, sometimes I feel like I'm the guy who's raining on everybody's parade because I'm always trying to recenter things to a more grounded, serious place, where people are having fun with their pet theory. And I'm always the guy that has to be like, well, that's probably not what happened, but let's keep talking about it. Anyway, so yeah, we do take it seriously. I think you have to.
So with some, older cases, time goes by, relationships change, maybe loyalties change. Maybe people that were afraid years ago aren't as afraid now. Do you feel like there could be some value in re-interviewing individuals here now?
I mean, you mean from a law enforcement perspective, right? Like in the investigation.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Yeah. No, 100%. Yeah, I think they should be. I don't know when the last time any of these guys were interviewed or gals, but yeah, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. And I also think there's opportunities that pop up in a case like this because the world that Lacey was involved in and where, as we know, most of the suspects dwell and or dwelled, and probably some of them we know still dwell in that world. There's opportunities to lean on people. There's people have been arrested for other things, and people who may have been around what was going on. There may have been moments where they were locked up and they could have been, talked to and sort of like given a deal if they spoke about this because this is a bigger case, right? And I think that's one of the things that you hope for in a case like this, right? That someone is going to come forward or that someone's going to be sharing a cell with someone who's bragging about being around when something happened and they talk, and that hasn't happened in Lacey's case. But yeah, I think re-interviewing, it's a great idea.
Yeah, I think so as well. After covering Lacey's case, what is it that you personally hope the viewers take away from this conversation?
That's a really good question. I think when I look at Lacey's case, I always, I guess if I wanted people to take something from it besides the obvious, I hope that somebody comes forward with information. I think the big thing is that, looking at people in their different situations in life and realizing that everyone is just as important as everybody else, right? You don't have to be a, 7-year-old, 6-year-old beauty pageant star whose case is enormously famous to get attention. I think somebody like Lacey, who hasn't been talked about publicly for many years, who had a rough history and had kind of rough stuff going on in her life, deserves attention. And I would want our viewers to take her story as seriously as some of these other more prominent stories that get a lot of discussion. I feel like that, again, was one of the purposes we decided to do this. And it still remains, my big hope when people watch this stuff, that's what happens.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Sean just said. There's these cases that tend to get elevated by the mainstream media and by, the media at large. People meet certain demographics and it's not always, there's this trope that it's like missing white girl syndrome, right? And, that's a real thing for sure. And there's a lot of like indigenous women who go missing that get no coverage. And there's a lot of African-American women who go missing, no coverage. But there's also, poor white people who come from the lower class who get passed over in this sort of like spotlight kind of thing. And I think Lacey falls into that. She doesn't meet the check boxes for the face on the milk carton. And because of that, her story isn't elevated, and that's why when people search it, they see me and Sean's stupid faces because we're the ones who spent all this time talking about it, right? So, yeah, I think Sean, that's exactly right. That everybody deserves a fair shake and everybody deserves attention, in these cases, and I think that's also from a law enforcement perspective,
Well, the truth is, in a story like Lacey's, where they're not really actually sure what happened to her, it would be really easy to just let that go, and be like, we can't figure it out. It's 17 years old, let's just quietly all move on. But when you talk to her family, there's zero interest in that outcome from their direction. And so because of that, it's valuable that we not let it go. It needs to be talked about. It doesn't matter if it was yesterday or 50 years ago. If there's family members around who still want answers, whose pain endures, then it's valuable to talk about and to try to, surface and give attention to. To us, anyway, we really firmly believe that.
As we move into the final part of the episode, I want to come back to something that we said near the beginning. Lacey Anderson was not just a timeline. She was not just a missing person report. And she was not just a body found months later.
She was 19 years old. She had people who loved her, people who still remember her, and people who have lived with unanswered questions since 2009.
And when a case stays unresolved for this long, it can be easy for the public to treat it like a puzzle. But for Lacey's family, this is not a puzzle. This is their life.
Every anniversary, every birthday, every holiday, every new article, every new podcast or video, it brings the case back. And if there are people out there who know something, they need to understand that the silence has consequences too.
And talking about the prior coverage with the family, these conversations that you had with her family members, in connection to this case, what do you think that people should understand when they're talking, when they're thinking about what Lacey's family has gone through, what their experience has been like over the years?
I mean, wow. That's such a great question, and it's subtly complex. I think every family is sort of its own little universe, and you interview these people, and you see such a wide variance of reactions and survival techniques. And sometimes people create nonprofits, and they start doing amazing things. People join up with Crime Stoppers and become Bob Nelly, who just passed away, was Liz Barraza's dad, who we became pretty friendly with because he was one of the first cases we ever covered, his daughter's death. He became like a mentor to other families who had lost a loved one and, taught them how to speak to cops, right? And, with Lacey's family, I mean, it goes everywhere from like the brother-in-law, Nick, who Sean was talking about, who had this dream of becoming a law enforcement officer. And after like involving himself in this investigation, got so turned off that he completely changed his career trajectory, to her mom, who, is just living in a pool of grief with no answers. It's a wide gamut, I think it's affected relationships within this family. I think it's made it's made them difficult for them to kind of have this closer relationship as they did before, not because of tension, but because they remind each other too much of Lacey. And there's, I think her sister talked to us about that, if I remember right, that her and her mom aren't as close because it's just too difficult, so it's got, I know it's a cliche, but it's that ripple effect that you hear about where the rock goes in the water and it spreads, and, one person disappears and it affects so many people.
One thing that stuck out to me that I'll add on there is when we interviewed Lacey's dad, Mike, he had this really emotional moment in his interview where he talked about the fact that he had been in trouble when he was younger, kind of like Lacey was. And there came, a time when he was sort of presented with the choice on whether or not to cooperate with police in something that was very serious. He chose not to. He did time instead. And Lacey talked to him when she was in her situation, and he told her, like a good dad, you should do the right thing here. You should tell them what happened and help make this situation right. And the amount of conflicted, I guess, regret. And he told her that, and then this is what happened. You know what I mean? And he knows that. And it's not his fault, certainly. But he wonders, about, should I have told my kid to do the right thing? And that is the kind of thing I don't think people understand, what these families go through. Little conversations, little moments, little, the last time I spoke to them, the last thing I said, did I have any part to play? Of course, Mike doesn't have a part to play in this. Mike did the right thing. He's a good dad. But that kind of thing is torturing him to this day, all these years later. And so I guess if people are going to understand anything, it's like, you don't know the half of it, of what this kind of a thing does to a family. We don't know the half of it. And we spend a lot of time talking to them. So yeah, it is profound grief. It is profound sadness. And again, I would put that to anybody who has information that could just, resolve this situation. Think about that.
So thinking about that information, if somebody is watching who lived in that Norfolk Pierce surrounding area between like August, November 2009, what would you ask them to think about? What kind of things could, like we talk about, like sometimes it's the tiniest thing. You think it doesn't even matter, but it really does. So what kinds of things would you want people to think about and bring forward?
Yeah. Anything that you think even could be remotely connected. I mean, if you heard a rumor, if you remember a MySpace post that struck you the wrong way, like really anything at all. It's our understanding, and I haven't reached out to the police to confirm this myself, but we've heard from some folks in that town that there has been a change in staffing on this investigation, and that there are fresh eyes who are very eager to review new information and old information. And so now is actually a great time to be reaching out with a tip. Even if you think it's not interesting, even if you think they've probably heard this before, don't be shy. Like now it is a rekindled fire. People are interested in solving this case at this very moment. And if you have the smallest tidbit of anything, it's worth a shot, and again, do it anonymously if you want to. There's nothing wrong with that. They review that information. They take it seriously.
We covered a lot, but before we wrap up, how has covering Lacey's case changed how you view cold cases or unresolved cases?
It's a great question. I hate to sound cynical, but I don't know that Lacey's case in particular has changed it for me because I've seen so many of these at this point. It's kind of reinforced some things, I think, that there seems to be a lot of distrust in a lot of small rural communities. There seems to be a serious drug epidemic that's affecting a lot of small communities across the United States that is unresolved and is just destroying people's lives. That's something that I've taken away from a bunch of these kinds of cases that we've covered. But I think at the end of the day, I think it's just important to remember that these cases they're not cold, to the families. The families are living within this reality. And from the night that Lacey left her mom's house and then never came back, time has kind of stopped for all of them in a way, and it's hard for their lives to really move on emotionally, socially, lots of ways. So I think it's just important to, to keep the family in mind and, remember that they're really living in this,
Yeah, I would second what Miles said. Oh,
Go
sorry.
ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I second what Miles said. I think if anything, Lacey's case hasn't necessarily affected how I look at cold cases or unresolved death, but it did affect the way that I viewed our channel. Like I said earlier, I think this was the first one for us that felt like, oh, people are actually watching this and it's making some sort of a splash in the place where it happened. And to your point earlier, that really reinforces the level of like responsibility we feel for the things that we do. That's been the biggest effect for me personally of this.
And always make sure that if you're going to say a newspaper did something, make sure you have the article on hand before you quote it, right?
It's a little scary
Absolutely.
to imagine that they reach out to you immediately. And I mean, hey, it's good to be fact checked.
No, yeah, it was.
Yeah.
It was definitely a little jarring for us, but you know what? They were really cool about it. I think they had a right to reach out, and we made a clarification, because we don't have to go into that whole story. I feel like we covered it, and it's so long, but yeah, it was an interesting moment for us, and I think that we grew as a channel in that experience. I'll just put it that way.
All right. So if Lacey's family is watching right now, they're watching this episode, what would you want them to know?
we're still here and we still care. And, we chose to discuss Lacey's case today for a reason. You made a big impact on us. All the families we work with matter tremendously to Miles and I should say. But yeah, I think that this is an example of not letting things go, even if they're old, even if they're underreported. We want you guys to know that we're still there. And if there's more developments, let us know. We'll talk to you again.
Yeah, same. I can't say more than what Sean just said.
Well, Sean, Miles, where can people find your prior coverage of Lacey Anderson's case and your other work?
Well, sort of, where we started is on YouTube, and that's still sort of our true love, I guess you could say, is keeping the YouTube channel going. So True Crime Unsolved on YouTube, and we are also an audio podcast now. So as Sean and I always say, if you don't want to look at our faces and just want to hear the information, you can go to anywhere where you get your podcasts, and it's Apple Podcasts, Amazon, iTunes, Pocket Casts, which I'm also not that familiar with, but I do know that we're on there. And I believe there's some other platforms too, but I'm
Spotify, the big one, yeah.
Spotify, thank you. I always forget about Spotify. But so everything's there, and our entire backlog is there in audio form. The only thing that we don't put up on the audio podcast is our comment reactions, because we only react to the YouTube comments, and we kind of keep that for our YouTube audience. But all of our old cases, all our case breakdowns, all of our interviews, everything's up there.
Got it. Absolutely. Please go and check them out. So do we have any final thoughts from either of you before we close out?
I just wanted to say thank you for what you guys are doing. You're a wonderful channel as well, and a wonderful website and community. And we really are honored that you reached out to us and discussed this case with us today. So thank you very much.
Yeah, agreed. It was great to meet you guys. It was great to talk, and big fan of what you guys are doing. And hopefully we can do this again.
Thank you so much. The feeling is definitely mutual.
Absolutely. Thank you. If you have information about the disappearance or death of Lacey Anderson, please contact law enforcement.
The Madison County Sheriff's Department page for Lacey's case lists several agencies connected to tips and information, including the Madison County Sheriff's Department, Norfolk Police Division, Nebraska State Patrol, and Norfolk Area Crime Stoppers.
You can contact the Madison County Sheriff's Department at 402-454-2110. You can contact the Norfolk Police Division at 402-644-8700.
You can contact the Nebraska State Patrol at 402-370-3456. And you can contact the Norfolk Area Crime Stoppers at 402-371-1000.
Even if you're not sure if what you know matters, please report it. Let the investigators decide.
And if you have documents, source material, corrections, or information that you want to share with our team, you can provide information at crimesolverscentral.com through our website. We are not law enforcement, but we can help keep attention on the case and direct people toward official reporting channels.
To Sean and Miles from True Crime Unsolved, thank you both for joining us and for the work you've already done covering Lacey's case.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Thanks for having us.
And to Lacey's family, her friends, and everybody who carries her memory, we are so sorry for your loss, and we hope that answers come soon.
Lacey Anderson was 19 years old. She mattered. Her life mattered. And the truth still matters.
If you found this episode helpful, please share it, especially with the people of Norfolk, Pierce County, or Northeast Nebraska in 2009.
Someone may know something. Someone may remember something. And one conversation could make the difference.
I'm Jace.
And I'm Charlie.
This is Crime Solvers Central. Thank you for watching. And please help us keep Lacey Anderson's case alive. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and stay loud.